From the campus of the University of Nebraska at Omaha. Consider This, a program of issues and information behind today's news.
New NASA research suggests that with high greenhouse gas emissions, we'll see declines in global crop yields for maize, corn, as early as 2030. Shifting rainfall patterns, higher temperatures, and increased atmospheric carbon levels are likely to affect where and how much of staple crops like corn, soybeans, wheat, and rice can be grown. By 2069 through 2099, global corn crop yields could decrease 24%.
Hi everyone, I'm Kathy Wyatt. Welcome to the 25th season and this week's edition of Consider This. Our topic, climate change. Joining us to talk more about it is Martha Shulsky. Dr. Shulsky is the state climatologist and director of the Nebraska State Climate Office. She is also a professor in the School of Natural Resources at UNL. Thank you for being here and welcome.
Thank you very much, Kathy. I appreciate the opportunity.
You bet. I want to start with just the definition of climate change.
So climate change, in a simple sense, it is alteration of the Earth's climate, and that happens in a natural sense as well as in a human-caused sense or anthropogenic sense. And the way our climate varies through natural changes is changes in the Earth's orbit and the amount of sunlight that we get, the amount of energy that we have to work with at the Earth's surface. That's what causes our climate to change naturally throughout history. It's what causes the cold ice ages and the warm interglacial periods. And then there's human-caused changes, which are an influx of greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere. So it's like putting on extra blankets to warm the Earth's surface. What these greenhouse gases does, and by that I'm talking about carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. So these are gases that we've tracked, and we can track for a long period of time, going back to ice core records and looking at paleoclimate, looking at the Earth's history through hundreds of thousands of years. And we can compare greenhouse gases a long time ago with present day what they are now. So we know that they are at levels now that we have not seen in human civilization. And the Earth's temperature tracks pretty closely to the amount of greenhouse gases that we have in the atmosphere. So the greenhouse effect we have known about for over a century. We've known about this physics that takes place in the atmosphere for quite a long time. So that's what we're most concerned with at present, is this enhancement of the naturally occurring greenhouse effect, which is causing the current climate change.
So let's just go back a little ways. You said this has been happening, climate change has been happening throughout history. At what point did we start getting concerned enough to be talking so much about this?
Well, so looking at the various indicators of climate change, so I'm talking temperature, changes in ice that we have, changes in carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases. In the mid-1950s, that's really when things started significantly ramping up. And some scientists say that we were entering into a new area called the Anthropocene, which is humans are having a significant enough influence on our climate that we can track it through geology, through the atmosphere, all these different ways that we can look at our signature, our fingerprint on the climate. So middle of the 20th century, that's when things really started to ramp up. And we've just been increasing really ever since then.
Okay, you mentioned causes, but I want to put a graphic up for our viewers and talk to us a little bit more about the primary causes.
So the greenhouse effect is a naturally occurring effect that we have in our atmosphere. So these are things, again, like carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. When these levels go up in the atmosphere, long wave radiation, so the Earth emits energy in thermal or long wave radiation that is absorbed by these greenhouse gases and re-emitted back to the Earth. That heats the temperature of the Earth. So that's kind of the extra blankets that we're putting onto the atmosphere. The sun's energy, that's a natural cause of climate change. The shape of the Earth's orbit, we wobble back and forth, we tilt. That essentially influences the amount of sunlight that we get at the surface. That influences our temperature. And then reflectivity, so the amount of ice and snow that we have on Earth that influences our climate as well. So ice and snow is very reflective. So solar energy that we get, 80 to 90% of it is reflected if it hits snow and ice. If it doesn't, then it's absorbed by the surface. That further warms the temperature of the Earth.
Okay, and humans play into this how, Martha?
So by altering our environment, by internal combustion engines, by using fossil fuels, that is how we influence the greenhouse effect. That's how we enhance this naturally occurring greenhouse effect. We also do things like irrigate crops and build cities. We change the land surface on the Earth, and that can change the climate at a local and regional scale as well. But the major way in which we influence our climate is through greenhouse gases.
Okay, thank you. And we have another graphic we're going to put up for our viewers, the effects of what's been going on. So walk us through that.
So there are many various indicators of the way in which our climate is changing. We can think about the different parts of the Earth climate system. We have snow and ice cover. So we have sea ice in the Arctic. We have major ice sheets in Antarctica. We have snow cover, seasonal snow cover. We know through satellite records that sea ice is melting at a pretty fast rate, in fact, in the Arctic. When we melt ice that is sitting on top of land, that goes into the ocean, that raises sea level. We also have thermal expansion of when the ocean temperature warms, the sea level will also rise. We have risen about 8 inches in the last 100 years, and that's projected to the rate of increase is accelerating, and that's projected to rise at a much higher rate than what we have seen in the past. So the rate of change going forward for sea level rise will be much greater than what we have seen, which is pretty typical when we think about climate change. The changes going forward are going to be faster and stronger than what we have experienced in the past. So heat waves is included there. That's something that is happening worldwide. So more heat events, just because the Earth's temperature is warming, we're more susceptible to heat waves and heat events.
Okay. Now, Nebraska has a climate office, of which you are a very important part. Tell us about that office and your role there.
So we exist, essentially, I consider it as a climate help desk. So we deal with all scales of climate, past, what was the climate of the past, over the period of record that we know and track, what is the current climate conditions, the fact that most of Nebraska is currently in drought conditions, and tracking current and emerging climate issues. And then increasingly we look and help people decipher climate projections. So taking these global or regional scale climate projections and putting that into the context of what are the implications for Nebraska? Why does it matter? What are things that I can do about it? We deal with many different sectors in the state, agriculture, water resources, municipalities, water management, forestry, faith communities, education, the media. It's anybody and everybody who has a question about climate or weather. Half of our office is staffed with meteorologists. So that's at our core. We try and track the weather conditions. So there's 4 of our staff members that are concerned with tracking our weather conditions. We have something called the Nebraska Mesonet. Mesonet is a fancy term for a weather observing network. We have about 60 stations in about 45 counties across Nebraska. We were one of the first state weather networks in the country. We started in 1981 with 5 stations, and now we're up to 60. So our goal is to track the weather conditions. We have above ground observations as well as below ground, and track things like soil moisture and soil temperature. In addition to air temperature, humidity, how much did it rain? That's our most popular sought after product, is how much did it rain.
Wow. That is pretty cool. Now, I have to ask, how did you become involved in this realm? What was your interest? Where were you when you decided that you were going to become a climatologist?
So my interest in weather started really early. When I was young, I lived in Nebraska City in the late 70s and early 80s, and we had a tornado warning, and I spent part of the night in the basement with my family, and I was 7, and I was scared by what was happening, and it made a big impression on me. And so I wanted to know, how do we explain what's happening, and how does weather influence people in our environment? And so that was my initial interest in weather. And throughout my graduate program and my first job, I worked at the University of Alaska in Fairbanks and was there for 7 years and in the mid-2000s. And that's where climate change is really up front and very real. And things are changing and happening very quickly there. There's a lot of implications. So that's where I got my stronger interest into climate-related issues and applications of climate and understanding climate change.
Wow, so help us understand it as it pertains to Nebraska. Let's drill down a little bit. And as you're talking, we're going to put up another graphic for our viewers. What are the greatest concerns here in our state when it comes to climate change?
So one of my biggest concerns is it may not be on there, and that is the recognition of climate change, that climate change is real and it's here now, and we have to plan for it. We have to recognize it and have to plan for it. That's the biggest barrier that I see that we're facing, but that's not something that we can't overcome because we should care that temperatures are going to warm at a rate that we have not seen, and we don't have the ability to understand given our past history, because we haven't gone through anything like this. Temperatures will be warmer, winters will be wetter, and summers will be drier. The growing season will be longer, but we will still have a risk of frost and freeze late in the season. So we can't necessarily translate that into we have a longer growing season, but we'll still have that risk of freeze because we do exist in the mid-latitude, and we'll still have winter in some form. So to me, it's kind of the rate of change that we're going to have to deal with, and then the recognition that this is a problem and we must plan for it and talk about it as the science that it is.
Yeah, and I think it's very interesting you would bring that up. I think that's a block too. But I think it's so easy for us as we go day to day to brush this off as, well, it's just an unusual year. When the reality is, if we look at the past several years even, to your point, it is ramping up. So when you say it's not something that we won't be able to overcome, what is your thought on how that's going to happen? Because there still are a lot of people who aren't quite buying into this whole idea.
Yeah, there are. So I've been in this role of state climatologist for about 6 years, and I remember speaking with certain groups that were maybe more, say, conservative leaning, more traditional agricultural practices, and it was difficult for them to recognize the threat of climate change. And that the tone is certainly changing now. Things like the flood of 2019, and when you can't get into your field and you can't plant, when there are impacts directly for a large number of us here in Nebraska, when it's real and it's local and you feel the impacts, that's when I start to see the tide shifting. And so I see more and more people concerned about and wanting to understand what the solutions are. So I see the conversation shifting a bit. There are certainly some that will disagree with that. And we're not where we need to be in terms of the state. We don't have a statewide climate action plan, but the city of Lincoln does. The city of Omaha is working in that direction. I've worked with the cities of McCook and Grand Island. They're incorporating climate change projections into their planning. There are natural resource districts that are looking at drought plans and tackling climate-related issues. So it is happening at various levels. We're not quite where we should be yet, but I think we're getting there, and I have hope that we're getting there.
And I think sometimes when you do put this in front of people and you actually give them the data, it's helpful. We're going to put up another graphic talking about water, right? And how incredibly important it is, especially to a state like Nebraska. Ogallala Aquifer, educate us a little bit about what this is and why it's so important to our state.
Yeah, Nebraska is exceptionally fortunate in that we have this big ocean that is sitting underneath us, this big water resource. We wouldn't be the Cornhusker State if we didn't have the Ogallala Aquifer. We have all these little straws that are pumping water out of the aquifer. We have the sand hills, and that is a big, significant recharge region for the Ogallala Aquifer. The rates of decline in the High Plains Aquifer are much greater further to our south. So water's being pumped out much more so than it's being recharged. Nebraska, we sit in the recharge region. We do have local control of groundwater resources, so there's another advantage. There are parts of the state that do see declines overall. Historically, it's being pumped, more water's being extracted than is being replenished. But for a lot of Nebraska, we are underlain with this vast resource of water. Water is not necessarily an infinite resource, and precipitation changes. So if we think of how our rainfall patterns have changed over time, we do see a slight wetting in the state of Nebraska. But going forward, what we're likely to see is wetter during the colder time of year and drier during the summertime, as well as hotter. So thinking about our current agricultural practices and how much water is used currently, it's only going to get greater because of climate change, and the current cropping systems or paradigms, will they even be viable given the temperature projections that we're likely to see? You can't put enough water on a corn plant, for example, if your temperatures are just too high, and say at night they don't get low enough so that respiration can happen. Or even thinking about cattle health, it's going to be quite warm, temperatures that we're just not used to and aren't necessarily equipped for. So what, in terms of health and viability of the current agricultural practices, I just don't see it as viable.
So what other options, it's always good to have a plan B. What other options do we have outside of the Ogallala Aquifer?
So in thinking in terms of water, so there are surface water sources, but those will only be more variable because of climate change. So thinking of water that comes from the west, comes from the Rocky Mountains, and Rocky Mountain snowpack is projected to be less, and that springtime snowmelt pulse of water will likely be earlier. So we'll be getting less water overall, and it will come earlier in the year. So thinking about rivers, there's probably going to be more variability in those stream flows compared to what we have now. So really less reliable.
So, loaded question, but then what does the future of the agricultural economy hold then for us in this state? If we continue, especially if we continue on this trend.
Yeah, so thinking about, when I envision the future landscape of Nebraska, thinking about certainly more diversification, and I think that reduces your risk to any sort of weather event. That just makes you more resilient. If you have a more diversified structure in place, maybe incorporating more woody species, thinking about animal agriculture, maybe smaller scale than what it is now. So again, that you are less vulnerable to extreme heat, to going quickly from too much water to too little water. So diversification and thinking of cropping systems that are less water and resource intensive.
Okay, so let's pretend like we have this big audience of farmers and ranchers sitting right here with you now, right? What would you tell those folks? I know education is a big part of what you're doing. What would be the overriding message if you could tell them one thing that would be imperative for everybody to be doing at this point?
Yeah.
What would that be?
So thinking of future viability and what do you want to pass on to your children and grandchildren, and making sure that you are reducing your risk as much as possible, and just thinking about your overall viability. And we don't have to keep doing what we have done in the past. Think of this as an opportunity to maybe pivot or shift into a different direction that maybe you hadn't thought about, or perhaps in the past thought maybe it was a little bit too risky to transition operations to something different. But utilize this as an opportunity to move into an area that you hadn't maybe before, and thinking about conservation and using our resources the best that we can.
Okay. We've talked a bit about agriculture, but there are also other facets of the state that are impacted by this, right? Tourism is one. There are others. Let's talk about that one first, and then we'll kind of go down the list as time allows.
Yeah, so thinking about recreation and tourism, I think of ecosystems and say the crane viewing. That's something that is going on now or just ending, and bird migrations. Every part of an ecosystem will be touched in some way by climate change. So think of your favorite fishing spot, maybe. Will that be available in the future? I don't know if that will still be viable. So ways in which we recreate now, if it's tied to water, think about more variability in stream flows, or maybe higher water temperatures, those kinds of things, or bird migration patterns. Those could be altered in the future.
Okay, and what about energy? Talk to us about the energy aspect.
Yeah. So energy is very interesting. That, to me, that's a big part of the solution to climate change is shifting our energy over to something that is not fossil fuel intensive or is not resource intensive. And Nebraska is a bit unique in that the energy that we utilize is different than the energy that is produced here locally. But thinking about how does climate change impact these different sources of energy, nuclear energy. I think of the 2011 flood and what that did to Fort Calhoun, and that compromised Fort Calhoun because of the flood. And the fact that we will be more susceptible to flood as well as to drought, say flood one year to drought the next year. So less reliance on water sources and the flows at what they are now. They could be different or will be different in the future. Or thinking about corn ethanol production, just input costs in the future, even those things that aren't maybe related specifically to climate change per se, but input costs might be something that's out of the range that your average producer can afford. But temperatures are going to be quite high, and the demand for water is also going to be quite high. So will that, all this corn production, will it be viable in the future to produce this ethanol? I don't know. That's something that we seriously need to consider. But certainly there's an opportunity for solar and wind production, even hydropower at the smaller scale, say micro hydropower, and diversifying those sources of energy and having it locally. I mean, if it's one thing that the current crisis going on globally right now is that less reliance on something that you get from somewhere else. If we can produce something, gather something locally, then the better off we are.
Okay, if we continue at this clip with these trends, what is it going to look like 20, 30, 50 years from now if we don't do anything?
Yeah. There is really no analog to what we're entering, which is kind of the scary part. But we will see changes and the rate of changes that we have not experienced, which will be very difficult to adapt to if something is happening much faster than what has ever happened in the past, that we don't have experience in those adaptation measures. So that's why it's really important to focus on mitigation in the next, tomorrow to the next 5 years. If we can put mitigative action into place, if we can put limits on greenhouse gases, reduce our footprint in the atmosphere, and reduce the amount of climate change, it is much less risky for us. It's a much brighter future the sooner we act.
Okay, we have about 2 minutes remaining. Final thoughts, especially thinking about places you've been, maybe on the other side of the state, to questions that you've had. What would you like to leave our viewers with in terms of climate change?
The main thing is that it's real and it's here now, and there are local solutions. It's really important to have the dialogue, a meaningful and impactful dialogue about climate change. Everybody talks about the weather. There's no reason we can't talk about solutions to climate change in a good, productive way. We're all in this together, so let's figure out these solutions together and come to the table.
We have been putting up your website and your phone number. Why don't you give that to us just verbally now? What is your website?
The website is nsco.unl.edu, and my phone number is 402-472-6711. We put out a monthly weather and climate summary if you want to track those current and emerging climate conditions that I talked about. If you want to track the real-time weather conditions, you can go to mesonet.unl.edu. You can look at the latest hourly conditions, how much rainfall did we get, and so forth.
Perfect. And we want to put up a few other websites for our viewers as well, for folks wanting more information. We're talking about climate change today. Climate.nasa.gov, then there's snr.unl.edu, Mesonet, as Martha mentioned, .unl.edu, and then CropWatch at UNL.edu. Martha, I want to thank you for joining us today and for sharing your time and expertise and just really stressing the importance of us addressing this topic sooner rather than later. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Kathy.
You bet. You bet. Thanks to our students who are working so hard behind the scenes, and of course to all of you for watching. As we close, a look at Ak-Sar-Ben Village as seen through the lens of Avery Howard, a senior at UNL. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next week.
Consider This is an issues and information program produced by UNO Television. More information and program archives can be found at nebraskapublicmedia.org/considerthis. If you'd like to share your comments about this program, call UNO Television at 402-554-2516 during regular business hours, or send an email to cwyatt@unomaha.edu.
It is the longest-running Omaha-based statewide television program on the air today. Hi everyone, I'm Kathy Wyatt, producer and host of Consider This. Now in our 25th season, we wish to acknowledge those who have made this educational journey possible. Our guests, underwriters, student crews, the Knowledge Network, the University of Nebraska at Omaha, and of course, viewers just like you. Thank you for watching.
Welcome to the Omaha News. We are Omaha. The complex was condemned by the city in January for numerous safety reasons.
We are truth tellers and award winners.
They process and recycle approximately 100,000 tons of material.
We are a community of strength and a team of big dreams. We are the Omaha News, where the people are the story.